Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're diving into part 3 of the infamous JonBenèt Ramsey case. I'm not really sure how bad the echo is for you, because it's still pretty bad on my end. I'm working on it. I have the stuff coming, but I absolutely could not go 2 weeks without an episode. I would never do like that. So, I guess we're going to deal with this audio. Hopefully it's not too bad. We'll see. We'll just have to see. We're rolling with it. We're in this beautiful new she shed. I have so many decorations and fun things on the way already. It's going to be a masterpiece when it's completely done. But my husband did work for 2 straight days to make sure that it was at least ready for me to record in today. So, he worked really hard. We're going to use what we got. So, we're getting into part 3 this week, so if you haven't already, then I would highly suggest going back and listening to the first 2 parts of this case before you try to listen to this episode. If not, this episode is not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. Because last week, we went over the timeline of events from the time that the 911 call was made to report that JonBenèt had been kidnapped for ransom, and then we went through a lot of the things that happened in between when the 911 call was made, up until the time that JonBenèt's body was found inside the Ramsey family basement. And then we talked through some of the events in the timeline that happened right after JonBenèt's body was found. Now, something that I said last week, I kind of wanted to go back and talk through it again, because last week I felt one way, and this week I've thought about it a little more, and now I feel a little bit differently. And before I do that, I also wanted to clear something up, because last week I mentioned that 9-year-old Burke Ramsey was taken to Fleet and Priscilla White's house early that morning before JonBenèt's body was found. But Fleet White took Burke Ramsey to his house to play with his kids, presumably with a nanny or a babysitter that was there with all of the kids. And then Fleet White came back to the Ramsey house afterwards. But I feel like I explained that in a weird way last week, so I just wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page with that little piece of information. And as far as what I feel differently about from last week to this week is what I said about Burke being taken to Fleet and Priscilla White's house. Because last week I was saying that I wouldn't let my kid leave my side. But then the more that I thought about it, the more I was thinking like, if my best friend was wealthy enough to have a nanny, or even if she paid a babysitter, I would still trust her and her judgment with my one remaining living child. If I were close enough with these friends that I trusted them to keep my kid, then I would probably trust them enough to know that they would be more mentally capable of taking care of my kid for long enough for me to at least get my emotions in check to be able to be a mom again. I don't know. I was just thinking a little bit more about it, and I wanted to mention it. And then we skipped ahead a little bit and left off in the interview with Detective Linda Arndt, and we listened to her talk about how she felt when JonBenèt's body was carried from downstairs in the basement up to one of the upper floors in the house. And then how she said that during a brief moment of eye contact with John Ramsey, that she wasn't sure if everyone in the room was going to make it out alive. And let's just remember that she said this in the most dramatic way possible, years after this investigation. And she was almost implying that she thought that John Ramsey was the murderer, except she wasn't brazen enough to just come right out and say that. And I know that I skipped ahead a few years to tell you about this interview with Detective Linda Arndt, but this just feels like something that you would probably want to mention immediately, especially if you're a detective. I mean, I know you can't go arrest someone based off of a gut feeling, but it would have been nice to know before years later. That's all. And it was also said during this same interview that Linda Arndt said that as soon as JonBenèt's body was found, that she knew exactly what had happened. Which is interesting because she could tell the rest of the world. Now, something that Detective Linda Arndt did mention early on, though, is the fact that she noticed that John and Patsy didn't seem to be speaking to or even interacting with one another that entire morning. And about that, I just feel like I don't care what shape your marriage is in. If you have a child with someone and then that child goes missing and is presumably being kidnapped, I just feel like both parents would be consoling each other, even if they hated each other's guts. They probably most likely don't hate their child. They would try to be there for one another. So it does seem weird that John and Patsy seem to almost be avoiding each other that entire morning, up until the point that JonBenèt's body was found. And then even after that, the couple still didn't comfort one another or try to console each other. And if there's ever a time to console your spouse, it would be right after you've just discovered your daughter's lifeless body inside of your family house. But Detective Linda Arndt wasn't even the only one that noticed that John and Patsy Ramsey weren't really speaking to each other or looking at one another or trying to console and comfort one another. Because the Ramseys' close friends, Fleet and Priscilla White, also noticed this behavior and they thought it was super weird. But they didn't really put much stock into it at the time, just because everybody's emotions were so hyped up and there was so much going on. Although over time, that would eventually change, and Fleet and Priscilla White would eventually get to a point where they did believe that John and Patsy Ramsey were somehow involved in JonBenèt's murder. But we'll get there. So, as of right now in the timeline, Detective Linda Arndt is still alone inside of the Ramsey house, but now she's not just there with these 9 or 10 other people, she's also still there alone, just now with 9 or 10 other people, along with JonBenèt's lifeless body laying next to the Christmas tree. But before JonBenèt's body was ever even found, Detective Linda Arndt had already called for backup over the phone twice. But both times that she called for backup, she was told that everyone who was available was either in a meeting or that they would be there as soon as possible. There just seemed to always be an excuse, and both times, no one showed up. That wasn't until Detective Linda Arndt finally called in a code black, which is police code for like dead on arrival, or just code that there was a dead body found. Either way, I feel like this was code for somebody get to this damn house because I needed backup hours ago. So with this code black, 2 more officers were finally dispatched out to the Ramsey house, and a forensics team was also sent out to the Ramsey house because obviously this is now a murder scene. Whether or not it was accidental or homicide, that doesn't really matter at this point. What does matter is there's a 6-year-old little girl who was just found dead inside of her own house. So, while everyone is waiting for the forensics team and the other officers to arrive, the Ramsey's pastor claims to have heard John Ramsey say something to the effect of, "I don't think he meant to kill her," which is a weird thing to say, especially when you consider the fact that you have a 2.5-page ransom note that literally says JonBenèt is going to be killed if X, Y, and Z happens. And then also, like, who is this he that John is referring to? I'm not really sure, but these all seem like valid questions to me. Now, it's not until this point in the case, after Detective Linda Arndt calls for backup, that the entire house is finally taped off as a crime scene. Now, mind you, all of these people have already been walking around this house, touching things, moving things, and even cleaning things all morning long. I feel like it's safe to say that it's probably too late to be taping off the house now. Because at this point, any potential evidence that could have been found and used has all been tampered with. Even if it wasn't tampered with intentionally, it was still tampered with. And another perfect example of this is when Fleet White went back down into the basement into the wine cellar again. This time Fleet went back to the wine cellar to grab the duct tape and the nylon cord that John Ramsey had pulled off of JonBenèt's body when he first found her. And then Fleet White took these things back upstairs to give to Detective Linda Arndt. Now, I can see how Fleet White was only trying to be helpful and how he was just trying to make sure that Detective Linda Arndt had all the things that had been on JonBenèt's body, but just him moving and touching those things contaminated that evidence that was found. And Detective Linda Arndt was still waiting for backup to arrive, so it's not like there was another officer there who would have been able to stop Fleet White from going back down into the basement. And like I keep saying, this is why this case is so mind-boggling to everyone, because so much happened that should have been prevented, but then at the same time, there was only one person there who was supposed to be able to prevent 9 or 10 other people from doing basically whatever they wanted to do. So it's like it's frustrating to hear, but then you can almost see how it happens, and that kind of goes for every screw-up in this case. But let's keep going. So after the two officers show up at the Ramsey house, they do finally decide to kind of rope off the whole house as a crime scene. And it was only about 10 or 15 minutes after the house was finally roped off that John Ramsey was heard on the phone with his personal private jet pilot that the family was supposed to be taking to go see John's older kids for Christmas. So John Ramsey's on the phone with his pilot, and this time John's on the phone with his pilot to let the pilot know to go ahead and get the family jet ready to take off for Atlanta. And Atlanta, Georgia is where the Ramsey family was originally from, so it would kind of make sense that John and Patsy Ramsey would want to go back to Atlanta, Georgia to be with the rest of their family. And this call to the Ramsey family pilot makes even more sense when you realize that one of John Ramsey's older daughters from his previous marriage, who had been named Elizabeth, had actually passed away from a tragic car accident at the age of just 22 years old. Now, John Ramsey's older daughter Elizabeth, who passed away in 1992, was also buried in Atlanta, Georgia. So I guess this phone call makes a little more sense when you piece together the fact that John Ramsey had already lost one of his daughters. So I could definitely see how he would want to be with his already deceased daughter and in the place where he was probably going to have to bury his newly deceased daughter. Which, that was where their home originally was Atlanta, Georgia. So this call to the pilot is kind of scrutinized, and it's also something that is kind of looked at as it's suspicious at first glance. But then once you know that John Ramsey had already buried one of his kids at a super young age, I feel like it doesn't really seem that weird that he would want to go back to Atlanta, Georgia, where his older daughter is already buried. And especially in a time like this. Now, something else that I don't think I mentioned earlier in this case is the fact that John Ramsey had in fact called his personal pilot once before earlier that morning. And he'd called him that morning before JonBenèt's body was found. And he had called to let them know that the family wasn't going to be able to go and leave for the trip that they had planned because JonBenèt was missing and the family couldn't find her. And I didn't actually remember if I mentioned that part already or not, so just in case I hadn't, I wanted to mention it now. Because it seems relevant knowing what we know now about John Ramsey's older daughter being killed in a car accident. And then piecing together the fact that John probably wanted to be with all of his children during this time, whether they were dead or alive. So just so we're clear, John had already talked to his personal pilot once that morning to kind of just inform them of the change in plans. But now, after the discovery of JonBenèt's body, John Ramsey was on the phone with the pilot again to try to get their private jet up and ready for takeoff to be able to take the Ramsey family to Atlanta, Georgia. And this is when the newer officers and or detectives on the scene have to tell John Ramsey, hey, so your 6-year-old daughter was just found dead inside your house in the basement. So, no, you can't just take off to a different state. We're going to need you to stay here and answer any questions that we may have. Which, again, as an outsider looking in, this seems like a weird thing for John Ramsey to be trying to get his family's private jet to take them to Atlanta. But honestly, I don't find it that weird when I look at it through the lens of being a parent. And John Ramsey even later ends up saying that he was kind of thinking that he needed to get Burke away from Boulder, Colorado, to keep him safe. And he also says that he wanted to try to get Patsy back with her family in Atlanta because obviously they need all the support they can get through this time. So this is something that a lot of people look at and they say that of course John Ramsey was talking to the pilot to get him to take him to Atlanta, Georgia because they were running away from the crime scene because they committed the crime. So about that, I feel like I've kind of explained the parental side, how I can kind of see why they would want to leave, and then, of course it kind of looks suspicious if you think that they're involved. So let's go ahead and move on in the timeline from here. So the officers and or detectives tell John Ramsey that the family isn't going to be able to just leave because now they're working on what seems like a murder investigation. So after investigators tell John Ramsey that they're not going to be able to get on their private jet and just head for Georgia, John and Patsy Ramsey did provide blood and hair samples to investigators immediately after investigators showed up at the house. And the Ramseys just kind of ended up staying at the Fernie's house in Boulder, Colorado in the meantime, which are the other friends that Patsy had called that morning after she'd called 911, and then Fleet and Priscilla White. So they ended up staying with the Fernies, and shortly after JonBenèt's body was found, John, Patsy, and 9-year-old Burke were all spoken to by investigators, but it was pretty briefly. And don't get that twisted, because by no means were they formally interviewed or questioned, because they were not. The officers who were investigating JonBenèt's death were actually kind of told by their superiors to handle the entire Ramsey family with quote-unquote kid gloves. Kind of in the sense like, if they don't want to answer questions, then don't force them. If they seem too stressed to do an interview, then just wait to do it. And this could have a lot to do with who the Ramseys were and their social status. Because again, we know the Ramsey house was never roped off as a crime scene. John and Patsy Ramsey were never separated to give their own individual statements. The house was never properly searched. None of the neighbors of the Ramseys were ever questioned or talked to. The neighborhood was never canvassed and searched thoroughly. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because some of the other things that never happened that should have absolutely happened are that John and Patsy and Burke's clothes were never taken into evidence to be tested for DNA. The Boulder Police Department rejected the FBI's help on this investigation until the 24-hour mark had already come and gone. And then to top it all off, the Ramseys weren't even formally interviewed by investigators until 4 months later. But, like I've said again and again, I'm getting ahead of myself, because we will definitely get there. So, for now, the Ramseys were lightly questioned and not at all interviewed or interrogated, and that was basically the end of that as of right now. So, it was at about 1:45 p.m. on the afternoon that JonBenèt's body was found that John and Patsy Ramsey go to the Fernies' house. And their 9-year-old son Burke was already at the Fernies' house, so at about 1:45, John and Patsy Ramsey leave their house to head to the Fernies' house where Burke already is. And from my understanding, John, Patsy, or Burke Ramsey never stepped foot inside of that house again after they found JonBenèt's body and left for the Fernies' house. Now, when they got to the Fernies' house, one of the Ramseys' friends, Mike Bynum, who also just so happened to be an attorney, was there. And he kind of tells John and Patsy that they may want to look into getting themselves an attorney. And a lot of people point to this exact thing and they say like, well, John and Patsy both hired an attorney right from the jump. That has to mean that they're guilty. But in our reality, this was just a friend of John and Patsy Ramsey's who thought it was probably a good idea for them to go ahead and get themselves an attorney. Which I feel like us regular people would probably find this suspicious as hell. But if you have more money than you know what to do with, and a friend of yours who is an attorney is telling you to hire an attorney, I feel like you'd be crazy not to take the free legal advice and get yourself an attorney. So that's exactly what John and Patsy Ramsey did. They hired attorneys almost immediately after they left their house on the day that JonBenèt's body was found. And if you've been listening to true crime podcasts or even TV shows for longer than 3 minutes, then you also know to always, always, always hire a damn attorney. Like, there's no good way to look at it. They're guilty because they hired an attorney so soon. They're idiots if they didn't. There's no two ways about that. Like, even if you're innocent and you don't think you need one, still hire an attorney if you can afford it, and they could afford it. So, John Ramsey essentially tells his attorney friend Mike that he can't deal with hiring an attorney right now, and John just kind of asked Mike if he could handle it for them. Hire them both an attorney and just kind of let a friend take care of what you need. So Mike does exactly what any good attorney would do. He goes out, just like John Ramsey asked, and he hired the biggest, baddest, meanest lawyers in all of Denver. And this is something that's kind of come back and bitten the Ramseys in the ass, because the Ramseys' lawyers were looking out for John and Patsy's best interest, which is exactly what you'd want in a lawyer. But these lawyers also did a pretty good job of casting at least some suspicion on John and Patsy for them not being fully cooperative with the investigation. Even though John and Patsy were doing this at the advice of their extremely highly priced lawyers. It's actually the craziest thing, because the Ramseys actually went on CNN and did an interview before they ever sat down and did an interview with investigators. And again, this is one of those things that'll kind of make more sense as we get further into this case, but I did at least want to mention it so that you don't think I'm being completely oblivious, as to why the Ramseys do look so guilty, no matter which way you spin it. And with John and Patsy listening to their attorneys and not talking to the police immediately after the body was found, that ended up causing so much of a distrust between the Ramseys and the Boulder Police Department. And that would go on for years. I feel like it's still going on today. So let's get back to the Fernie's house after John, Patsy, and Burke arrive. Burke was questioned by Boulder Police Department, and during this interview, Burke claims that he'd slept through all of the commotion and all the chaos that happened in the house that morning while everybody was looking for JonBenèt. Now, Burke would later say that he was actually awake, but that he was only pretending to be asleep. And this is always another big thing that people point to, and those are the people that are in the camp of people who think that somehow 9-year-old Burke was responsible for JonBenèt's death. But in reality, this could just be a 9-year-old boy who isn't sure if he's in trouble or not for something that he either did or didn't do. Either way, I don't think it matters, because at that age, even if you didn't do anything wrong, when the police want to talk to you because your little sister's found dead, I feel like most 9-year-olds would automatically assume they're in trouble even if they didn't do anything at all. But regardless of why Burke switches up on the fact whether he was asleep or not, in this interview with Boulder Police, he says that he was asleep throughout the entire morning until he was woken up to go with Fleet White to the Fernie's house. So Burke's kind of questioned, and he says he was asleep through everything, and then later on that evening, John Ramsey goes on a walk with John Fernie and another one of his buddies. And during this walk, John Ramsey is obviously a mess. He's sobbing and blubbering, and this is kind of to be expected, considering that he just found his 6-year-old daughter dead in the basement of their house earlier that morning. But during this walk, while John Ramsey is sobbing, and he says out loud something to the effect of, like, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." And of course, once this comes out and is public knowledge, people automatically jump to that being John Ramsey confessing to the murder of JonBenèt. Now, I don't believe that this was his way of confessing without confessing. I think this is one of those lock yourself in the bathroom kind of moments when you just cry and apologize to your kids for every little thing that you've ever done wrong. And I feel like the only difference between a bathroom cry and this is that John Ramsey did this in front of 2 of his closest and most trusted friends. And for those of you who aren't parents and have no idea what a bathroom cry is, let me explain. A bathroom cry is when you're just overwhelmed and you feel so defeated, and the only thing left for you to do is to lock yourself in a bathroom and cry to yourself. And a lot of the times, this involves reminding yourself of every single possible way that you might be fucking your kids up as a parent. And you just apologize for it. You apologize to your kids because, they think you're an adult and you have your shit together. They think you're great and you think you're screwing your kids up. So you just apologize to them without them ever hearing it. For me, honestly, I feel like this was John Ramsey's bathroom cry. He trusted these 2 men enough to have a bathroom cry in front of them and not inside of a bathroom. Because to me, this just feels like John Ramsey apologizing to JonBenèt repeatedly for not being able to protect her, not being able to keep her safe. And this is one of those things that you would do in a bathroom cry. This is also one of those things that people often point to and say that this was John's way of confessing without actually confessing. So I feel like depending on what you believe happened to JonBenèt, you'll either view this sobbing apology in one of 2 ways. Either this was John Ramsey just bathroom crying and apologizing to his daughter for failing to keep her safe, or this was John's way of confessing and getting this off of his chest without actually confessing. And again, that depends so much on what you think actually happened to JonBenèt and who you think is responsible. So let's keep going within the timeline, because shortly after this walk with his 2 friends, the medical examiner finally shows up at the Ramsey house at like 8 p.m. on the day that JonBenèt's body was found in the basement. So this would have been like 6 or 7 hours after JonBenèt's body was found, and I have no idea why it took the medical examiner so long to show up to the crime scene, but here we are. And with the medical examiner not showing up until 6 or 7 hours after the body was found, that just makes the time of death so much harder to determine. So now the time of death window is even more difficult to predict, like that wasn't hard enough already, because now she's been laying there on the floor next to this Christmas tree for an extra 6 or 7 hours longer, just waiting on the medical examiner to show up. And maybe it took so long because it was the day after Christmas and there hadn't been a murder in Boulder for that entire year. So, safe to say that the medical examiner probably assumed that it would be okay to go somewhere further away for the holidays, because chances are nobody would need him. But on this day, they did need him, and he probably wasn't expecting to be needed. So, when the medical examiner shows up, he notes that JonBenèt's body is covered in a blanket and a Colorado sweatshirt. And I'm not sure when or who or why someone put a Colorado sweatshirt over JonBenèt's body, but they did. And now that's just more cross-contamination of evidence. That's just more fibers and DNA and particles put on her body. And then that would make it even harder for the investigators to know what came from the killer and what came from the blanket and what came from the sweatshirt and what came from Patsy and John laying on top of her body. It's just a lot. The medical examiner also takes notes of the cords that are wrapped around JonBenèt's neck and the cords that were wrapped around JonBenèt's wrist when she was found. All of the marks, bruises, abrasions, and etc. were also noted. But we'll get further into those things as we get into the findings of the autopsy. So, after the medical examiner did a brief overview of the crime scene and the body, JonBenèt's body was removed from the house shortly afterwards. Now, the actual autopsy on JonBenèt's body wouldn't be done until the next morning. And it was during this autopsy that we finally have a time frame for her time of death. It's not a very pinpointed time of death because the time of death was listed between 10 p.m. on December 25th and 6 a.m. on December 26th. And December 26th was the day that JonBenèt's body was found in the basement. So basically, JonBenèt could have possibly been murdered anywhere in between the time that the Ramseys got home from the Christmas party that Fleet and Priscilla White threw, all the way up until the next morning, shortly after Patsy Ramsey says that she woke up for the day, before she discovered that JonBenèt was missing. So that doesn't really narrow it down very much, but that's what we have to work with. And while the autopsy does list the time of death between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. the next morning, they do kind of feel like JonBenèt was probably killed sometime closer to the 10 p.m. time frame, just for the simple fact that decomposition had already started. And then just looking at JonBenèt's pictures of her body, because yes, those are just floating around out there on the internet, but in those pictures, the only thing you can really see as far as what could have possibly been the cause of death would be the cord that's wrapped around her neck. But during the autopsy, it was found that there was a pretty significant skull fracture to JonBenèt's head also. So her official cause of death is listed as asphyxia due to a strangulation, in addition to the skull fracture. And honestly, I've never been able to find anything that says whether JonBenèt was strangled and then struck in the head, or whether she was struck in the head and then strangled. But then that also makes me wonder why there was no blood from the head wound. Because the head wound is pretty severe, so I'm not sure how that would have happened without a decent amount of blood being found at the scene. Not unless she was strangled to death and then struck in the head just as an extra precaution to be sure that she was dead. Because if she was strangled to death and then struck in the head, her heart wouldn't have been pumping blood anymore because she would have been dead from the strangulation. So if that were the case, then there probably wouldn't have been massive amounts of blood. That's really the only way I can figure it in my head for the lack of blood to make sense, because if someone is already dead and then you hit them in the head with something, the blood would have already stopped pumping through the body, so that would make it where even if you did hit them, they wouldn't bleed like that. I don't know. I'm not even close to a doctor, and if you are a doctor who's listening to this and you have an answer for this, lack of blood for the head wound, please email me because I'm genuinely so curious about this. Now, also during the autopsy, it was found that the cords that had been wrapped around JonBenèt's wrist, that they hadn't been tied tight enough to even leave a marker on her skin, which suggests that the cords had been tied around her wrist weren't tied very tight at all. Which this makes a lot of people speculate on if the wrists being tied together wasn't something that was done by someone just to stage a crime scene. Like, for example, if JonBenèt was already dead and then her wrists were purposely tied together to make it look like an intruder had done it, because why else would you need to tie her wrists together if she were already dead? And as always, this is alleged and pure speculation from theories that are floating around freely on the internet. Please don't sue me. Now, while the cords on her wrist weren't super tight, the cords around her neck were extremely tight. And without going into super graphic detail, JonBenèt's eyes show that she was still alive when her murderer used the homemade garrote on her. And as far as the cord that was tied around JonBenèt's neck, it was from a fresh new roll of cord. You know how shoestrings have those little pieces on both ends that kind of keep the strings together that, keeps them from fraying apart? Okay, it's one of those same kinds of pieces that were found on the cord that was tied around JonBenèt's neck. So it was obviously from a new roll of cord or string or, whatever you want to call it. Because the rest of the cord that was used to tie her wrist together was very obviously cut. You know how when you cut a string or a piece of yarn, it looks like it's frayed and coming apart at the end? That's what all the other cords looked like, and they had been obviously cut. But the one around her neck had that one piece, like the end that comes on a shoestring. That makes me wonder why her killer would have made and used a garrote to strangle JonBenèt and then tied her wrist together. Because if the piece, like the shoestring piece on the end of the cord, is on her neck, that would have meant that they made the garrote first. You would think you would tie her up so she can't get away first, right? That would defeat the whole purpose of tying her wrist together if she had already been strangled and was dead. Unless somebody was trying to make this look like a crime scene. Again, maybe it was staged. But just the fact that the cord around her neck and the cord used to make the garrote were cut and tied first, before her hands and wrist were ever tied together, that just makes this very much look like something that was staged and done as an afterthought. Now, it was also concluded during the autopsy that there was no evidence of rape, but it did suggest that JonBenèt's vaginal area had been wiped clean. Although there was no semen found on, near, or inside of her body, however, it did appear that she had been sexually assaulted with a paintbrush either right before or shortly after her death. And this is the thing that makes a lot of people cross John and Patsy Ramsey off of their suspect list, because what parent is going to sexually assault their own kid with a paintbrush in an attempt to cover up a murder? Because a lot of people think that it either had to be John or Patsy Ramsey that killed JonBenèt, but a lot of them think that if it was John or Patsy that likely killed JonBenèt, either accidentally or in a fit of rage, that they staged the crime scene to make it look like an intruder had come in and killed JonBenèt. But this sexual assault with the paintbrush is where they just lose me on that theory. Because even if they did kill JonBenèt, whether it was an accident or during a fit of rage because she wet the bed, or, whatever, if they did kill her, why would they feel the need to sexually assault her with a paintbrush? That just seems like a little too far in my opinion, but crazier things have happened. And there are a few doctors who say that they believe that JonBenèt had likely been sexually assaulted more than just the one time right before or shortly after her death. But then her regular doctor, like her family pediatrician, had been seeing JonBenèt for practically her entire life. And her pediatrician had never seen or even suspected sexual abuse, or any other kind of abuse for that matter. And this is where it gets pretty frustrating for me because of the way it's worded. Because we know that she was sexually assaulted with a paintbrush, which is also what the homemade garrote was made out of, was a paintbrush. But the way it's worded makes me question if this means that JonBenèt had been sexually assaulted repeatedly over time, or if it was just something that seemed more like it had happened one time before her death, aside from the time right before she died. And I'm not saying that as if it's better or worse if we knew for sure that she had only been sexually assaulted once, or if it was a recurring thing, because either way is awful. But I do feel like if we knew for sure one way or the other, maybe we would be able to narrow down the list of people that she was around all the time that would have had the opportunity to sexually assault her on more than one occasion. And then maybe that would narrow down the suspect pool some. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud again. Now, there were some other weird things that were found during the autopsy, like small droplets of blood that were found in JonBenèt's underwear. And when I say droplets, I mean like the smallest amounts of blood that you can possibly imagine were found in her underwear. Now, while we're on the topic of JonBenèt's underwear, let's talk about the DNA that was found, because there was DNA that was collected from JonBenèt's underwear and in the waistband. But none of the DNA that was collected from her underwear or the waistband matches anyone who lives inside the Ramsey house. And we'll talk more about this DNA that was found in her underwear, but just as a quick side note before I forget to mention it, all of John Ramsey's older kids who didn't live in the house with him, Patsy, JonBenèt, and Burke, they had all been tracked down, questioned, and they all had rock-solid alibis. So this was able to be ruled out pretty quickly, and they were almost all immediately taken off the list of potential suspects. And I guess they did kind of have to look into JonBenèt's older siblings who didn't live in the house, because 99% of the time, when a child is murdered at home, it's almost always someone that's either a family member to the child, or at the very least is somebody that the child is super familiar with and somebody that they know. And we will talk more about the underwear DNA, but there were other things that were found on JonBenèt's body as her body was examined more closely. It was found that on her back and on her neck, there were marks that were thought to be from the prongs of a stun gun or a taser of some kind, which kind of does go along with the thought that someone came into the house and disabled JonBenèt and then took her down in the basement to murder her. But then the duct tape that was covering JonBenèt's mouth had a perfect imprint of tiny lips on the sticky side of the duct tape. So that would kind of indicate that JonBenèt wasn't trying to yell or scream or fight or cry when the duct tape was put on her mouth. Which again, this kind of makes it seem like whoever put the duct tape there, that they only put it there after she was already dead, or at the very least after she was already unconscious. Because if she were alive or even unconscious, she would have been moving her mouth, yelling for help, trying to scream out for help. But if she would have been doing those things, the lip marks would have been smeared and smudged all over the place. So we wouldn't have perfectly outlined lips on the sticky part of the duct tape unless she was already unconscious or already dead, because the outlines were pretty perfectly placed lip marks. So the lip outline being almost perfect kind of makes it look like the crime scene was staged, like that was placed there after the fact, as an afterthought. And that's one of the biggest problems with this case, outside of how badly the evidence was handled at the crime scene. There are so many different things that make this crime scene look staged, and then there are a ton of other things that make you wonder if somebody did actually come inside the Ramsey house and kill JonBenèt that night. Because the Ramseys did have an alarm system, but it wasn't set on the night that JonBenèt was killed. And then after investigators looked around the Ramsey house after JonBenèt's body was found, they did find that there were multiple different windows that had been left unlocked that night and that were normally left unlocked. So that would have made it pretty easy for somebody to break in. So the intruder theory is possible, but it's also possible that the crime scene was staged. Anything's possible in this case, and none of it sounds too outlandish to make sense. But let's keep going. Because shortly after the autopsy was completed, John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey all moved back to Georgia where they had lived before. John and Patsy had other family in Georgia, John Ramsey's older kids were in Georgia, and John's older daughter, who had passed away in the car accident, she was buried in Georgia. So the family went back to be where they felt most at home and where they had more family and support. And a lot of people point to this and say, oh, they left for Georgia so soon after JonBenèt was murdered that they must have been running from something. And to that I say, you would also want so much support and family around you at a time like this if you were in their shoes. So I kind of get it. But let's keep going, because I want to go over why it matters so much if JonBenèt was hit in the head first or if she was strangled first. So real quick before we go any further, because that all depends on who you think is responsible and how that all matches up. So there's a camp of people that think that John Ramsey is the one that killed JonBenèt. And those people typically seem to think that JonBenèt was strangled before she was hit over the head. And they think that this was all caused from John sexually assaulting and or raping JonBenèt. And that things took a turn for the worst, and then John Ramsey had no choice but to strangle JonBenèt before she was hit over the head. And then there's a group of people who think that 9-year-old Burke Ramsey killed JonBenèt over some jealous sibling rivalry gone wrong, and that John and Patsy Ramsey helped cover it up so that they didn't lose both of their kids at one time. And the people that think that it was Burke usually point to the incident that happened when Burke hit JonBenèt in the head with a golf club. This was sometime before her murder. But everyone that was there when Burke hit JonBenèt in the head with a golf club, they've all always said that Burke accidentally hit JonBenèt in the head with a golf club. Like maybe he was swinging the club and she was standing too close to the club. Because I can definitely see a scenario where Burke swings and JonBenèt's just standing too close and she gets hit in the head. I've actually seen this happen with kids before, and it's just a total freak accident. So the group of people that think it was Burke think that she was hit in the head because he's angry and jealous, and then Patsy and John strangled her to help cover it up. And then, of course, we can't forget the people that think that Patsy was the one that killed JonBenèt. Now, the people that think that Patsy is responsible typically seem to think that Patsy hit JonBenèt over the head with something because of a bedwetting accident. And they think that after JonBenèt was hit in the head, that Patsy tried to cover up the accident by strangling JonBenèt and making a garrote to make all of this look like it was an intruder, which then brings us back to the intruder theory. And it seems like it's pretty split down the middle on whether you think she was hit in the head or strangled first when it relates to the intruder theory anyways. But let's keep going in the timeline. So now that the Boulder Police Department had JonBenèt's body for the autopsy and, examination and stuff like that, it seems like the police department was trying to kind of hold JonBenèt's body there until John and Patsy Ramsey would finally agree to talk to them and be interviewed. So the Boulder police were essentially trying to hold JonBenèt's body ransom in exchange for an interview so that they could question John and Patsy. And this is what I was saying earlier, that because John and Patsy's attorneys were telling them not to talk to police, this caused a huge distrust between the Ramseys and the Boulder Police Department, because eventually the district attorney had to step in and tell Boulder PD to give JonBenèt's body back to John and Patsy. And I think that this was probably one of the first things that made John and Patsy Ramsey feel like the Boulder police weren't trying to help them, but that they probably felt more like the Boulder police was trying to convict them instead of help them. And like I said already, John and Patsy had already hired attorneys, and they had done this at their advice of a friend who was also an attorney. But then they also hired a public relations firm or a PR firm, which is typically something that a big company would hire to deal with like media outlets and news reporters and things like that. So I'm not sure why the Ramseys would need a PR firm aside from trying to keep their name out of the press, but that wasn't going to happen regardless. So this is about the time that Boulder Police Chief told the public that this was an isolated incident and basically telling the public that they shouldn't worry about it. And I'm not sure why the police chief would even say this, because whether or not an intruder killed JonBenèt, or if it was somebody that lived in her house, there's still a murderer walking around freely and unknown either way. So this is actually something that the public would want to know about and should probably be worried about. But back to Boulder Police Department trying to hold JonBenèt's body for ransom in exchange for an interview. So in my opinion, this is where the divide between working with law enforcement and working against law enforcement started, was when Boulder PD tried to kind of keep JonBenèt's body as a sort of ransom until John and Patsy would agree to come in and be questioned or interviewed. So this just made it extremely, extremely hard for Boulder Police Department to finally get John and Patsy Ramsey to agree to be interviewed. Because if you feel like the police are trying to convict you versus help you find your daughter's murderer, I don't know that you would help them either, especially if you weren't involved. Let me just say that part, especially if you weren't involved. If you had nothing to do with your child's death, but you still thought the police were trying to pin you for it, I don't think anybody would cooperate. That's crazy. Why would you put yourself in prison and then now nobody's looking for her murderer? This is what I mean when I say that I can see both sides of every single part of this case. So, when John and Patsy did agree to be interviewed by the police, they almost had like a criteria or stipulations that they expected from the Boulder Police Department, and they expected them to live up to that. For instance, John and Patsy Ramsey wanted to know what topic of questions they were going to be asked. They also wanted a copy of any statements that they had already given to Boulder police officers, whether it was the statements that they'd given at the crime scene or at any other time after that. They wanted every copy of every word they'd ever said to anyone that worked at the Boulder Police Department ever. And this is another good point that my husband made about this case, as we've been talking about it for the last week, or longer probably. But I was kind of explaining to him how John and Patsy Ramsey wanted all of their previous statements that they'd made before they would agree to be interviewed. And he immediately cut me off and said something like, yeah, because they needed to make sure that they could remember whatever they had said in case they had lied about something. Because it's a lot easier to remember the truth than it is to remember a lie. And he's not wrong. I honestly cannot come up with another reason why they would need every single previous statement that they've ever made to Boulder Police Department, besides them trying to keep up with any lies that they may have told. Allegedly, of course. But regardless of why the Ramseys wanted their previous statements, all of this going back and forth between what the Ramseys wanted in exchange for this interview and what Boulder Police was willing to give for this interview, it ended up being 4 months after JonBenèt's body was found. Yes, I said 4 months after JonBenèt's body was found, before John and Patsy Ramsey were ever formally and officially questioned by Boulder Police Department about JonBenèt's murder. John and Patsy Ramsey were finally interviewed and questioned for the very first time on April 30th, 1997, a little after 10:30 in the morning. Let me just remind you that JonBenèt's body was found on December 26th, 1996. They were not questioned and interviewed for the very first time until April 30th of 1997. Yes, that is a perfect stopping point. We've covered a lot of information this week, and we still have so much more to get through. We haven't gotten to so many things like the pineapple and the flashlight. There's so much to get through. And we're already on part 3. So next week, we'll dig into the first interview that the Ramseys finally gave. We'll probably talk about their CNN interview, but that they gave before they actually talked to the police. We maybe even get to the pineapple next week. We'll see. I'm not rushing this one. I'm not putting a cap on the number of episodes that I'm doing on this case. I'm just going to do it in full. I was thinking like, oh, I'll stop at 5. I'll cram it all in and make it 5 episodes. I'm not doing that. I'm giving this case the time that it needs and deserves. And hopefully, let's all pray to whatever we believe in that I get this she shed like soundproofed to the max, because this echo's driving me crazy. I'm sure you can hear it. It's got to be driving you nuts. If you haven't already, please take time to leave a review on Apple Podcast or even on Audible. If you've listened to at least 3 episodes and you've liked them, then the 3rd time's a charm and it's time to leave a review somewhere. And if you haven't already seen the new she shed that I got for Christmas, after it's finished, check all the socials. It'll be there sometime today. And before I sign off, let's get to the review of the week, because this is my absolute favorite part of every Wednesday. I also just noticed you can hear every squeak in my chair, and you've never been able to hear that before because the old one had carpet, this one has hardwoods. I'm going to spray some WD-40. Let me go find the review of the week. Be right back. This review comes from Apple Podcasts, and it comes from Brianna Steele, or Brianna. Spelled like Brianna, but I know people that pronounce it Brianna. But regardless, it's 5 stars. It says, best podcast. I found her on TikTok. I binge listened to all of her episodes within a few days and was so upset when I caught up to her newest episodes. Now I can't wait for Wednesdays to come. My husband hates riding in the car with me because she's what I listen to instead of the radio. I love that she has her own opinions on what's going on in the cases, and she takes herself into the scene to tell us this story. Thank you very much. That was so sweet. You're my favorite person this week. Y'all can probably hear my dog stomping around the hardwood now. This is a big adjustment for me. I'm so sorry this episode is such a shit show. But we'll still do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.